Hi, I'm Anna, and welcome to the Read to Heal podcast by Novelly, a nonprofit on a mission to get ebooks by underrepresented youth published and taught in the English classroom so that every student can feel seen and represented and inspired by what they read. Today's episode is a conversation with our youth ambassadors and guest author Alissa Xiao.
Hi, I'm Harnoor.
I'm Madi.
And I'm Alissa.
Today we'll be discussing Alissa's poem, The Year of the Rat, which is currently available in Novelly's digital library. Alissa Xiao is now a sophomore studying public health and English at Furman University in South Carolina. She enjoys writing and sharing her experiences as a Chinese American. She hopes to inspire and connect people all around the world with her writing. Year of the Rat is a powerful poem that explores the anti-Asian racism that rose due to the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, all of you, for being here today. Before we get started, this episode is being recorded right now as part of our Giving Tuesday campaign. If you share our mission to get student voices like Alissa's published and taught in the English classroom, we encourage you to donate through our website, novelly.org. As a bonus, donors will be invited to future live podcast recordings like this one. Now that we've got that out of the way, I just want to say that Year of the Rat is one of my favorite poems in the Novelly library. I've read it so many times, and I'm very excited to discuss it with you all. So to start us off, our first excerpt from Year of the Rat deals with misinformation. So I'll go ahead and read an excerpt. The monster takes its vengeance inside my school. Names itself after a girl in my biology class who thinks she knows everything. She claims it started when some genius decided to eat bat soup. Cites her sources from Instagram stories and clickbait articles. How does the spread of misinformation through social media affect society today? And how has Alissa's poem impacted your view on this?
Yeah, I think social media kind of creates this ideological bubble. And for young people especially, a lot of the people I know get their information from infographics and from Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, and they don't ever bother to check them just because they feel like it sounds true, which can really feed into confirmation bias. And people don't see any information that challenges their viewpoints, which is really harmful if that information is not true or not based in scientific evidence. And it really leads to your views only being reinforced because social media is designed in such a way that it shows you more of what you're viewing and engaging with. And often when actual scientific peer-reviewed information about things like pandemics come out, people are already so ingrained in the conspiracy theories that they've picked up from social media that they look at them skeptically, or they start to mistrust science. And the consequences of this can be very real. And we've seen this with a spike of anti-Asian hate crimes that happened during the pandemic years and continue to this day. And while the pandemic was happening, and even now, I've met a ton of people like the girl mentioned in the biology class, people who claimed that COVID was a bioweapon or that it was harmless and there was no need to get vaccinated. And it was almost like talking to a brick wall because they had gotten so much of their information from social media that it was so deeply ingrained that I couldn't really convince them of anything otherwise. And it was deeply saddening and really frustrating. And so I think there's real harms to the way that social media spreads information.
I completely agree with Harnoor. I think social media is a really great tool for spreading information, but I think that a lot of the times those infographics and all of the really reshared kind of like liberal, like, look at me, I'm so politically aware posts are actually so oversimplified about the conflict and about the issue that they're about that they actually don't inform anybody reading them. It kind of like is selling the idea that you're informed and is virtue signaling to everybody who follows you that, oh yes, of course I know about this topic, when really you've just read 6 sentences on 10 Instagram photos and you're now like gonna talk about it like you know what it's about. And I also think that this is like in its way a form of misinformation because it is like kind of breeding ignorance in the way where when people who are actually misinformed and who are actually saying like in your classes like, oh, it's a bioweapon, or like, oh, like he's secretly like he's secretly a Nazi or something, or like, oh yeah, that was a terrorist weapon, like stuff like that, that's just so crazy and you know that it's wrong, when they say stuff like, "Oh yeah, not a bioweapon." Prove it's not a bioweapon. How do you know it's not a bioweapon? And people who are misinformed will not accept any information that isn't actual information. So if you don't know your sources and they know their sources, even if they're wrong sources, even if they're blatantly incorrect, you are still the losing side of that battle. So the oversimplification of information, even if it's correct information, even if it's with the best intentions, it is still misinforming because it's breeding ignorance, and it leaves like a simple, and it's so simple that it leaves so much room for like a wrong interpretation or like a lack of information about bias or where the information on that post is coming from, that it really can just screw you over, to be honest.
Agreed with everything that Harnoor and Madi said. Within the context of COVID-19 and the misinformation spread, um, I remember at the beginning there were a lot of memes that were shared around my peers about how um, COVID started because a Chinese person ate bat soup, and it was considered like funny in some sort of way. And though it may be considered somewhat of unconscious or quote unquote harmless racism, it falls back on very old stereotypes that date back to classist and imperialist roots as well. Um, and these internet memes have very real consequences, as we've seen in a very sharp increase in Asian American hate crimes throughout 2020 till now. And For the poem itself, I wrote this poem in the very beginning of the pandemic, so my feelings were still very, very raw. And what the two classmates said in the poem to me, and the misinformation I saw on the internet, a lot of it just hurt a lot to me specifically.
Thank you all for sharing your insights, especially as people who were in high school students during the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Another thing I want to bring up is what I think this poem did extremely well was humanize Asian Americans during a time of anti-Asian hate. It's an emotional gut punch. I think it's very hard to read this poem without feeling some type of way. And I think that's best exemplified by the last excerpt that you can see. So I'll go ahead and read it. They investigate our markets, our black hair, our black eyes, our yellow skin, and deem each breath we take as tainted. Our voices rattle in our own homes, and yet no one seems to hear us. My next question for you all is, why do you think people resort to racial scapegoating and dehumanization both inside and outside of the context of the pandemic? And how has Alyssa's poem impacted your view on this? Alyssa, since you wrote these truly beautiful words, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, so I believe it is, or in the context of COVID, of course, I believe it is very easy for uninformed Americans to fall back on racism or xenophobia specifically because of the amount of political discourse that surrounded the relationships between the US and China, even outside of the pandemic context. And due to this, the um, American individualism tended to other um, Chinese people or Asian people. And so I believe that, or not I believe, but going through a pandemic is a very traumatizing experience for all. And it created a lot of confusion. And when people are confused, they try to find the simplest reason for it all. And again, with the misinformation spread on the internet, on the news, a lot of people began to echo the first things that they saw on the internet, and that was mostly hate. Um, I remember, again, at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of the news reporters who were reporting about the statistics, the death statistics in China specifically, had a very passive tone with how they presented the news, as if it's almost as if like the Chinese people deserved it in a way, which is not what they said, but it was implied in their passivity of their words.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think scapegoating is based on this natural human instinct to try and avoid complex issues. So, hating Asians for COVID or blaming job loss on immigrants are really simple explanations with a single straightforward solution. which is, keeping the other out of America. And in reality, things like viruses or large political shifts are super complicated. And most of the time, the people studying them don't even really have very simple explanations. However, during such a stressful time like a pandemic, when something like your job or even your life is on the line, I don't think people are really comfortable with hearing "I don't know," and so it's very easy to fall into these us versus them dynamics, which are pretty innate in humans. And we've seen this throughout like American history and world history in general, where during times of crisis we tend to try and find a very simple reason, and that simple reason often happens to be a group that we disagree with. And I really think that the only way we can counteract this is by trying to humanize people, like Alissa did so beautifully in this poem, because scapegoating relies on you stereotyping and not seeing the individuality in the group that you are scapegoating. And throughout the poem there are mentions of this dehumanization, that turning people into statistics and assumptions, and using derogatory terms, but especially not listening to the people who are trying to tell their own stories. And I think it's so important to try and when marginalized people speak up, to listen to them, because it can really change the way you view the world and keep you from falling into these very easy like mental patterns. And I think just telling a story can be this incredibly powerful thing to prevent hate from spreading during times of crisis.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Harnoor and Alissa said. I have experienced a lot of like teenagers in my classes that are kind of like on the line, where sometimes you're in a class you're in a class with a kid and they say something and you're like, that's something that if I unpack it, I'm gonna like be too worked up to do the actual work I have to do, but I'm gonna remember that for like the rest of my life. That's gonna haunt me. And sometimes it's like a kid saying dropping a slur in the middle of like a lecture or like a lunch table, and sometimes it's stuff where they say something that's so politically like crazy, or like they say they believe conspiracy theories, much like Year of the Rat. Like it hits you and it stays there. And I've talked to adults about it, and they're like shocked that teenagers like have all this like hate speech, or like there's like graffiti at my school, and they're like, whoa, like I thought it was like a good school. And I'm like, it is a good school, but I think that teenagers are really easy targets to learn hateful behaviors, right? From parents, from media they consume, right? All these things are targeting teenagers. And especially since teenagers are missing a lot of context, right? If you talk to a teenager, they don't know the context historically. They don't know enough about science. They barely about science, about like the world, to question what people are telling them, right? So if you get fake statistics and you don't know how to actually analyze statistics, or like if you're given fake information about vaccines and you don't know what an RNA is, you have no idea what's going on. So it's really easy to believe this misinformation. It's really easy to learn these hateful behaviors when you don't know stuff like the history of the American government versus every minority that's ever been in America, stuff like that. And I really think that, like Harnoor said, the easiest way to do this is just have information about, like, have exposure to other cultures outside of your home and outside of what you're consuming in schools, because that's the easiest way to kind of channel this learning directly into teenagers' environments. Much like how, you go home and you hear your parents speak, and then you go in school and you learn that, oh, this is the actual history of like Asian Americans in America. Like they aren't just coming over. Like there's a very long history. Stuff like that, I feel really needs to be in school, especially modern perspectives. Like people of color didn't only exist in the past. Like they're here now, and there's stories for now that are just as important. And I think this poem is a really good example of that.
This was too short, but I just want to say thank you to Harnoor, Madi, and Alissa for having important conversations like this. I think it's conversations like this that make the world a better place. And I also want to thank our live audience for being here as well. Make sure to stay after we're done recording for a 15-minute live Q&A session with our youth ambassadors and our guest author who are here.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciated the opportunity to get to speak about a topic I hold very dear to me.
Great. If you're interested in learning more about our work at Novelly, be sure to check us out at novelly.org, and we'll see you next time on the Read to Heal podcast.